Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And I'm very happy to see so many people here today because it's great that you have a vibrant community. So I'm preaching to the converted when I say it's time for change. The classrooms 100 years ago haven't really changed much today. We're still sort of looking one-on-one and at the lecture, which I will be doing, talking at you instead of talking with you. But for the purpose of today, I'm going to give you a bunch of snapshots on what I do. You're all familiar probably with these statistics about how we live in exponential times and how we're digital natives, and that a week's worth of the New York Times contains more information than a person was likely to come across in a lifetime in the 18th century. We have to keep these stats in mind because when we think of how much information we process, we have to be able to digest it and do something with it. Google processes all of these searches per second. It's estimated that 1.5 exabytes of unique new information will be generated worldwide this year, and that was in 2007. So what do we do with this rapidly changing information? I'm going to talk more in terms of medical students and how to help them. But in general, I wanted to sort of say how this is part of a big SSHRC, which is a Canadian federal government social science humanities research grant that has led to a partnership between 17 institutions to really look at ways in which we can design technology-rich learning environments to improve education from childhood to adulthood in multiple disciplines. And so it's quite a broad mission, but by having these interdisciplinary partnerships, it allows us to look at learning and affect in different areas. Our goal is really to engage the positive emotions and decrease negative ones. Many people don't think about emotion in the context of learning, but it exists, and the killer one, of course, is boredom. And how we all want to make sure that our students aren't bored so that they remain engaged and retain their interest in schooling. And we're also interested in the stealth assessment of learning using technology, and that's Val Schutz's word. But the fact that we can look at learning dynamically using technology without students feeling any anxiety is a very positive thing. So as I said, I guess we're up to 19 universities now that are part of this. The disciplines that are involved are educators, psychologists, computer scientists, engineers, physicians, historians, ethnographers, and together somehow we share this common mission and try and use our different terminology and theory-based learning to inform the methodologies that we use to study learning and affect in these different domains. So my domain is obviously medical education, and I'll talk about that. Some of the technology-rich environments that we've been exploring are simulations, intelligent tutoring systems, serious games, augmented reality. If any of you are interested in some of these other things, you can come and talk to me later. So, to get to the point, what should teaching and learning in the 21st century look like? How can medical schools address these needs? And what does it take to be a successful learner in these situations? I'm going to talk a little bit about how advanced technologies can foster learning, teaching, and assessment using these different medical simulations. And I'll end with a question as what it takes for systemic change. So medical schools, like any domain that you pick, we're interested in the cognitive components that are part of the decision making that students need to think about, critical thinking, problem solving. And we're looking at expertise across specializations, so building models of what it means to be proficient within these different specializations. Again, medical students and doctors have to be lifelong learners, just like the rest of us, because if they don't go into a continuing education situation, you know that you're not going to be very happy when you go see your doctor who hasn't been recertified in the last 20 years. So flexibility as learners is very important, and the ability to adapt. Social skills is something we don't really think about so much in these learning situations, but even in medicine, social skills and collaboration are essential to team performance and effectiveness, since one must listen to the other members of the team in order to be most effective in managing the patient, and also understand the hierarchies involved in the medical situation and to overcome them for patient safety situations. The multiple perspective taking and socially shared regulation is something that we've been exploring. Metacognition, self-regulated learning, how do physicians and students learn to plan, monitor, evaluate, and control their learning, and how does that also affect affect and emotional regulation. So in medicine, students have to learn how to regulate their emotions as well as their patients, and I'll talk a little bit about how students learn to manage giving bad news to patients, but they also have to manage angry patients all of the time, so they have to sort of sit back and regulate their own emotions as well as others. Motivation, how do you persist in these high stress environments which with a lot of diversity, and these are things that we're interested in. So some of the frameworks that I use to think about better forms of instruction, most of you are probably aware of these, but I'll go over them because expertise is still something that I think is important to think about when developing technology-rich environments, because you need to have this identification of the different levels of proficiency of the cognitive components in the task and context in which you're studying, because that helps you differentiate learners along a trajectory of learning. And by identifying the different cognitive components, you can then identify ways in which you can give feedback. There's one chair here and one there. Learning who needs help when and where. And since we're trying to help learners become more proficient, we need to know what they need to be proficient on. How do you help students eventually regulate their own performance and know what they know and what they don't know? And this is something, obviously, you want people to be independent learners eventually and be able to correct their own performance. Cognitive apprenticeship, again, most of you in this room should know about these theories, but I love this model because it really is all about situating learning in a realistic context where people feel like they're doing things that are meaningful rather than separate from or too abstract, I guess I would say, from how they will actually use that knowledge in the real world. So how do you situate the learning in authentic context with scaffolding dynamically so that people are learning in the context in which they will use this eventually? And finally, the mind-body-spirit connection, which began being studied as early as William James, maybe even before, of how emotions go hand in hand with the mind. And some of the constructs we're interested in are caring, empathy, emotion regulation, interest, persistence, value, control, attributions, and the basic emotions of joy, boredom, anger, etc., etc. So how can simulations foster learning, teaching, and assessment? And I just define simulation broadly as something that is made to look, feel, and behave like something else, especially so that it can be studied or used to train people. And the beauty of simulation is that it feels real, as I said with the authentic apprenticeship, so it's valued. It feels like you're actually in the mode of doing something and doing and deliberately practicing something in the simulation that gives you feedback and assessment and helps you learn. And there are variations on the theme, especially in medical education, and probably more so than in other domains. So medical simulations, we have whole centers of medical simulations, and some are designed to just work on the technical skills, training how to suture, how to do a vein harvest, things like that, which is a technical skill, really. And then there are serious games that embed you in a situation that feels very realistic. We have augmented smartphone applications that can act as sort of a support system for learning while you're doing something, whether it's about emergency medicine or something else. We have animations of how a system works. So many people are interested in modeling how the heart works and what does it look like when you get a blood clot, or what is it when your lungs fill up with water. And those animations are also interesting, making you think of how these systems work in a different way. Modeling cause and effect. If this happens, then that happens. And then we have something as big as team-based simulations where you're working around high fidelity mannequins that are attached to all of the types of medical equipment that would be in the hospital. So you have the mannequin that acts like the patient, the machines that act like real machines, and then you have the people that are around the mannequins trying to save the patient's life. So you can study lots of things in these contexts. You can also look at the intelligent tutoring systems environments that are designed more for one-on-one instruction with individualized feedback and finally, the virtual reality immersive environments. Some of you might have seen the Imperial, I think it's called Imperial College of London, that has virtual worlds where you can go and do surgeries and meet pedagogical agents, and you could be your own agent talking to a tutor that looks like another animation, but you're actually working within a distributed reality. So all of these different simulations have different degrees of fidelity. And I think that most people that are working in real world contexts are interested in these things, and psychologists are interested in these things from a different point of view. So we might be interested in how closely does it approximate the cognitive skills that you need to acquire in order to be proficient? How closely does it approximate the technical skills that people would need to perform in the real world? Does the material feel right? Physicians that are working in simulations spend hours with building these models to see whether this is really what it feels like, and when you're trying to suture or do whatever, does it feel like it would in the real world? But others are interested in the emotions people experience in these contexts and how they regulate their emotions when somebody's dying in front of your eyes. Can they manage? Do they know who to contact? Do they know what to do in these situations that cause stress? And socially, in terms of the groups that you're working with. So some of the questions that that I pursue in these worlds, one is about diagnostic reasoning, and I'll show you a little bit about that. But do students become more accurate and more expert-like in the processes that they take during clinical reasoning? In other words, do they formulate their diagnoses and their clinical hypotheses in a way that more experts do, and do they take the right actions to actually solve patient cases in a more expert-like fashion? In simulation teams, how do effective teams differ from less effective teams? And a lot of what we do is look at Solis's model of mutual trust, leadership, and mental models, and all of these things that can be looked at in the discourse analysis of the teams to see what differentiates the effective team from the less effective team, and supporting that kind of knowledge with instructors that are also evaluating the performance. But a lot of what we found is that if the leader is not leading, obviously the team falls apart. That seems obvious, but when you actually see it in some of these simulations, it's pretty interesting. Technical skills. So some of my students are looking at students who are doing surgeries in the OR and doing surgeries with simulation, and using eye tracking to look at the areas of interest that they're attending to. So are they actually doing the technical skills? Do the eye movement data demonstrate that they're doing the right procedures technically? And patient communication. Do students identify and respond to patient coping strategies appropriately in pre-post tests with standardized patients? I'll tell you a little bit more about that, but essentially in order to be a good communicator as a physician, you first need to know what your patient's coping strategy is. Since if I'm crumbling before your very eyes as a patient and the physician is just telling you everything you need to know about breast cancer, that's not a good strategy. So there are ways of actually telling people to identify what that patient wants to know. Some people want to know everything. So do different differences in emotion emerge across different training environments? Obviously, it's difficult to study emotions and eye tracking in the real world. It can be done. But the whole beauty of simulation is you're hoping that the simulation environment will train people up faster and mimic the same skills but learn quicker than you might in real case performance. So can you do some comparisons between simulation and real case, which is, as I said, a task, but eventually will be done. So in terms of the scaffolding that's important around these training environments, we're interested in the cognitive scaffolds that help people along the way in terms of whatever context they're in. The metacognitive ones in terms of planning, orientation, monitoring, etc. The motivational ones, which are also interesting in terms of identifying attributions that people have. And the emotional scaffolding that people might need to do in the context of a particular environment. And I'll show you how that plays out. Some of the things that I'll talk about today more particularly in terms of the 5 contexts. One, as I said, was about diagnostic reasoning, critical thinking, and problem solving using BioWorld, which is a deliberate practice environment for clinical reasoning. And the second one, which Cindy and her students and mine have been working on, is called Howard Now. But basically we've been looking at communication, empathy, and perspective taking at a distance to support problem-based learning through small group facilitation using technology. And we looked at military trauma teams who are being prepared, who have never met before, and basically get together and they're sent over to wherever they're going to be deployed to work in these horrible places. How do you get these teams to actually be effective teams with very little time to work as a team? So the Simulation Center works on this. We also have this augmented reality mobile app that we're working on for the deteriorating patient that is really looking at how to manage medical emergencies and in the face of diversity. And finally, I'll show you a little bit about emotional regulation in technical skills training. Some of the things that we're looking at, I call them digital footprints that you can look at in terms of learning in simulations. We do, being the cognitive part of this, really has to get at the think aloud data of problem solving while people are solving these problems. The log file analysis of all the interactions that students are doing with technology are also logged, so you can do a lot of learning analytics and pattern matching. The electrodermal activations, we use bracelets that are basically looking at how much am I sweating while I'm doing this, and where is it that I get nervous, and then we have facial expressions based on Ekman's. We have the face reading technology that can look at your basic emotions while you're learning, and posture, which is basically, are you leaning in, leaning out, what are you doing, are you bored, are you engaged or not. Eye tracking, we have portable as well as standalone things where we look at areas of interest that people are looking at. Questionnaire data, which is, I wish that everything could be so simple as doing questionnaires with thousands of people because they're so easy to administer, whereas the rest of this stuff takes a lot of time, and unfortunately. Brain imaging, we have these wonderful tools to look at that as well. So we put all of this together in different experimental paradigms to look at different questions. Obviously, converging this data takes a lot of time, but because we have such variety of evidence, we can make interesting hypotheses about learning in these contexts. So BioWorld looks like this. It's actually changed from what it looks like now, but it's really looking at the cognitive components of diagnostic reasoning. And we've looked at expert-novice differences on solving specific cases to get a better model of the expertise of how people solve cases. We're not trying to make people solve problems in the same way. We want to sort of look at what processes are involved, and so looking at how people differ in terms of whether they're at least doing tests that are appropriate for the hypothesis in question. Do they collect supporting evidence that matches their hypotheses, and what do these patterns mean in terms of overall learning? And as they're learning, how strong is their beliefs in their current diagnosis, so that we can really see whether they're just sort of playing a game in terms of just clicking every option, or are they actually believing what they're doing? So I call this a deliberate practice environment because they get to practice with feedback over and over on different cases, and they're encouraged with their metacognition because as they see a case, they have to first tell us what evidence is important in the scenario, which you can't read from here. But basically every patient has symptoms and they have a patient history. And what is it in this patient history that is evidence that it supports your hypothesis that this person has shigellosis or whatever? And then the models of expertise are used to scaffold the learner. We're now building this more open environment with more complicated problems, and hopefully it'll be up and running soon if I ever get my programmer to commit to something. So what are some of the things that we're comparing at the end is their final diagnosis or hypothesis and the expert model of what evidence they collected in terms of what was appropriate for that disease, what diagnostic tests that they collect that were appropriate for that disease, and the student can compare their traces with expert traces to see what they did that was different than an expert. You can do that through simple comparisons like this, but you can also do it through case summaries which compare the explanations of experts versus the explanations that the students give. So some of the questions that we ask: do students become more accurate and more expert-like in the processes that they take during clinical reasoning? Is there a relationship between help seeking and improvement, and what role do emotions play once feedback is received? And do high performers have higher self-regulated learning? And what emotions do students experience during and after solving patient cases? What emotions are experienced in response to feedback when they are incorrect? And as you can imagine, I'm trying to remember if I actually answer all of these in this presentation. I think I do. This is the setup for BioWorld, where you have the video cams in front and you have the think alouds with your headset where your audio recording their think alouds. And the bracelet, you can see that Melissa has a bracelet that's measuring the physiological data. And the user interactions are all assessed in this context. So what we see, I'll show you just one student at the end of BioWorld who's looking at her comparison to an expert's prioritized evidence list and the expert's report, which again is hard to read there, but whoops.
Wow, his pheochromocytoma. That is really, okay. That was out there.
So you can see there's some emotion being demonstrated, right, even without the words.
Let's read this, we got it wrong. Tumors found anywhere in the common adrenal medulla. Hypertension.
What this student does, though, is dials right into the data and starts to compare her processes to an expert. Where some, who we have seen where their feedback is getting the same feedback that's not in concordance with their hypothesis, will get angry. So it's really interesting that what we've been looking at their attributions and looking at mastery versus performance goal orientation and seeing whether emotions and feedback are related to that. Mastery learners like this one are much more interested in dialing into the data and seeing what they got wrong, whereas those that are performance oriented are angry because they didn't meet their goals. So these are things that you can study with all of these measures. We have case builders for instructors to build cases. You don't really need to see all this, but all to say that through these multiple data sources, we can look at the process data, what tests they took, and the product data, whether they got it correct, the emotions experienced overall throughout the event, but also emotions experienced at various locations in BioWorld. So you take a test result and it's unexpected. What does your face tell you, and what does your affective bracelet tell you in terms of that? And then we use text mining to look at these case summaries that they say this is which they write to pass on to the next physician. And we do pattern analyses to see whether novices write the same kinds of case summaries as experts, and whether there's any model that you can come up with that tells the differences in the disease categories. And obviously the think alouds tell you the reasons behind their diagnoses, and the questionnaires are great for looking at emotions before, during, and after. So that's a case summary that a student has written. And what do you do with all of this data? So you can, again, qualitative analysis is what we do a lot of, but this is something that can just be thrown into a model. Throw the case summaries in for text mining and see whether you can see whether all of these summaries come up with those that are in the accurate diagnosis. Can you tell the incorrect from incorrect summaries? And is there a model underlying these summaries once you look at them? And we've been able to determine that these cases and the summaries through a text classification can really show that they're pretty accurate in determining what disease and what evidence of that disease matching the words with the correct categories. So that text mining is pretty much accurate in these cases, and you can 98% match the diagnostic categorization for particular diseases and form these classification models. And once you do that, we're hoping to have better forms of, the assessment can lead to better scaffolding. So moving right along, students solve more cases with practice, become more expert-like. they don't help seek a lot, which is interesting. Medical students are high achievers, as you know. They only spend 10% of their time help seeking, and usually they only ask for help when they get a result that is unexpected. Curiosity and positive emotions are experienced overall, but anxiety or confusion experienced when lab tests are contradictory to their diseases, their diagnoses. And as I said, performance versus mastery-oriented students experience different emotions when they receive feedback. I would imagine that a lot of these sorts of things could be studied in different contexts. And moving on to another project, which Cindy has been instrumental in, is a communication project that has looked at students in Hong Kong and McGill in a problem-based learning activity where we're really trying to help students learn how to give bad news. And what does that mean? This is just a little vignette.
Unfortunately,
that seems to be the case.
I need to close my head. Is it mean that I'm going to die?
No, not at all. Not at all. Don't give up hope so easily. There's many trees. We can take as much time as you need to talk about these things, but
I have to.
How old are they?
5 and 2.
5 and 2. Okay.
So part of the video exemplar context will get students in a small group to say, you know, do you think this physician communicated bad news appropriately? Or do you think this physician could have done something differently? And a lot of people, interestingly enough, think that this physician is arrogant, which I think is very kind, but there are differences, and just sharing those multiple perspectives in a problem-based learning environment and looking at things from sort of the medical cognitive algorithm which they use can get people to sort of look at the medical interview in terms of whether the right knowledge was communicated, whether they were empathetic at the right time, etc. But we've been looking at this at a distance. And the first time we did it was with Adobe Connect, where we connected synchronously with Hong Kong and McGill, and Cindy, being the expert PBL person that she is, was our Wizard of Oz, who helped the medical tutors tutor this international problem-based learning environment. And what we did was the problem-based learning, where people were talking about vignettes that were from Hong Kong and from McGill and sort of comparing the differences between physicians and how they communicated bad news. That was sort of thought of as an intervention. Before they went into the PBL, every individual got to practice giving bad news to a standardized patient, which is an actor that acts you know, with a particular script of what's wrong with them. And they did it before the intervention and after the intervention so that we could look at comparisons of what they learned. And the algorithm, the spikes model on the right-hand side, is what we were looking for in the discourse, whether they were paying attention to the setting, knowledge giving, etc. And what we found was that, you know, this was a really great and positive experience where people learned, but it was a small pilot where people were learning what the spikes model was, and we also learned about patient coping and whether they could identify the patient coping mechanisms. But it's not easy to sustain, because it's basically, we had to be up at 7 o'clock in the morning and they were up at 7 at night, which was inefficient. But some of the questions that we had were, do students learn how to conduct a medical interview? Do they regulate their own emotions and that of their patients? Can they identify and respond to coping strategies in the pre-post tests? And do students work cohesively in the PBL? So how do they co-regulate each other? And can we, now our question is, can we scale this up with technology using asynchronous forms of instruction and using dashboards? So the challenges for this: how does a facilitator know what is happening when you have 8 groups that you're trying to do online at the same time? So even if they're working asynchronously, how does the instructor come in and tutor when they're supposed to tutor? And how can a facilitator provide support that's created just for that group, never mind whether they're there or not there, but can they give more nuanced feedback to the group? And how do you maintain progress through the learning cycle in this group? So again, this is Cindy and Peter and students and others that have been involved in this. Cindy's very proud of the acronym, Helping Others with Argumentation and Reasoning Dashboard, which for those of you that love Howard, know why that's important. But what we have now is a student platform and an instructor platform for asynchronous communication. So the students have a structured whiteboard space where they can comment on each other's team members' text and annotation of video cases. And the instructor can have a dashboard that determines the group activity and some metrics for that group activity of where they should intervene. And this is a work in progress, but this is what the whiteboard looks like now, where students can go into the video exemplars and interrogate it, and Cindy can give you much more on this later, but it's a fun tool. And so if students want to look now at these video exemplars and annotate it and say what the physician did well or didn't do well, now this is uploaded and shared with others, and it's like a collaborative text where you can carry on the conversation about the same event. And so that gives everybody an opportunity to share what they know and don't know. And then if you have 3 groups and the instructor is monitoring 3 groups, you can have little metrics that are demonstrating what the percentage of the group is you know, how much they're talking in terms of the word counts. What are they talking about? Who's talking the most? And, you know, which ones are more effective? So I know you can't really read all those metrics, but then you have the word clouds that can determine who's leading the thread and are they actually on task or not on task, and what are they talking about. Okay, again, Cindy and Peter can tell you a little bit more about that, and I'll just move on so that we can get to the end. This is what the team effectiveness medical trauma simulation looks like. So here you see the medical teams in front of, you have the mannequin lying down, you have all of the medical equipment that I was telling you about. And so all of this is videotaped, audio taped, and for debriefing purposes by the medical instructors, but we use it to determine how leadership evolves and how patient management evolves. And so it's quite the complicated process to analyze it, but do teams become more effective with practice, and what does an effective team look like that's different from a less effective team? So one of my students, Ilian Cruz Panesso, has been looking more at sort of a social network analysis of low performing teams and high performing teams. Whoops, that went on by itself. The only thing you need to pay attention to here is that you can see that there's much more you know, more connections on the high-performing teams between the group members, and versus the low that are very few connections between the team members. And what we're showing is that the high-performing teams show greater leadership. You see that there's very little thread on the low-performing teams in these 3 simulations. And mutual trust amongst the members is also a very important part of success. Situation awareness, knowing what the other member of the team needs and how to respond in that context, and closed loop explicit communication between team members. And you see again on the low performing, there's very little thread between group members in terms of the communication. So these are things that if you can identify, you know, effective and more proficient teams and how you might scaffold them, then, you know, you're ahead of the game. The Deteriorating Patient Serious Game app looks like this. This is also based on a cognitive model of performance of what we call the ABCs of medicine. Jeff Wiseman designed this. Every medical student that has a medical emergency has to go and determine whether the airway, breathing, circulatory drugs, there's this rhythm that they have to go through and make sure that things are working properly. So even if the person comes in with one problem, you know, or one disease, one problem might be more predominant that they have to attend to right away. Because if the person's not breathing and they have something else wrong with them, obviously they have to handle the breathing problem. So what this app does is sort of talk about ways to manage the different parts of the algorithms with the right actions and the right support, and knowing when you should, you know, residents need to know when to call for help because they don't always have all the right information. So the metacognitive aspects of handling a medical emergency is knowing what you know and what you don't know. And so do students learn the ABCs of medicine, how to handle emergencies, and do they learn to manage their stress in emergency situations? And this is the sort of thing that we're looking at right now. So what are the cognitive aspects of the deterioration, and what are the emotional aspects that sort of interfere with your thinking? Okay. So the last example is the emotions and performance in surgical education. We compare the emotional states during learning with a real case, as I said, in the operating room and in situ in the simulation. And we look at emotions, attention, and performance during these experiences, and look at expert-novice differences in regulation. And so you've got the mannequin on the bottom, the real case on the top, and we've been looking at electrodermal activities, self-report, and eye tracking to look at differences in these two contexts. And some of the questions here would be, do differences in emotions emerge across different training environments, real versus simulation? And no surprise that simulations are less emotion provoking than the real world. Do differences in emotions emerge across different levels of experience? Yes. Sometimes oddly, that expert physicians show a lot of pride at the beginning and report a lot of pride, and then once they're after performance may not be so proud. So it's it's very interesting to look at the change in emotions. And how do emotions relate to attention processes, and linking, sort of the high stress to what part of the operation is most complicated, and what do the eye movements reveal. So this is Melissa Duffy's research. She's a PhD student at McGill that's just finishing up her thesis now, and looking at vein harvest in looking at gaze activity of where they're focusing. And what we do is we look at the areas of interest that are highlighted and calibrate that with the medical instructors to make sure that they have, we're looking at the same thing in the way they would, and we then validate that with some of their own benchmarking metrics that they have for studying performance in surgery. So, what are some of the lessons learned? Can't really read that over there. Advanced simulations can provide these realistic cognitive apprenticeships that support different types of thinking that's expected in practice. We can look at cognition, problem solving, clinical reasoning, and decision making. We can look at the procedural understanding of these specific technical skills and how they're performed. And we can look at better accuracy and performance using these, whether they develop using these simulations, as well as metacognition skills that help learners plan, monitor, evaluate, and control their own learning. And we can also look at ways in which they support communication and social skills and team effectiveness and multiple perspective taking and socially shared regulation, as well as these wonderful positive affect issues of emotion regulation, confidence, persistence. So they do provide opportunities for making data-driven decisions about what works in specific contexts. And in summary, what I've been trying to get across is that these theory-driven designs lead to different types of engagement and practice, and that you can assess things in a more stealth-like manner without people feeling pressured. And we've just shown some examples of that. And what I think is interesting is that it can allow you in the end to change instructor roles from transmitter to facilitator by having these embedded ways of assessing people in the context of their learning. One of the questions that, it's not really a question, it's a statement. We all know about the triad and learning affect, learning assessment and curriculum being so important in understanding the cognitive proficiency differences in a specific domain and looking at how expertise evolves and using the evidence between how people learn and how we assess them, and making sure that the curriculum embeds these different types of designs for facilitating growth in a particular subject matter area. I guess my image on the right is saying that technology-rich environments provide a platform in which to study this, and that adding another dimension, which is not always discussed, is the affect dimension, that we need to look at these things together. And medical schools have what they think is a real-world apprenticeship. It is a real-world apprenticeship, but it's not a cognitive apprenticeship. It's a real-world apprenticeship because you learn by the bedside. But it's only as good as the tutoring and the amount of practice you get on the right skills that you're supposed to be doing. So, one doctor, one medical student may see 3 cases, the other one might see another 5 different cases, and not everybody has the same set of knowledge after leaving their residency training. It's sort of like you see what you get. So it's sometimes inefficient, and if you can provide simulations that give everybody the same background, the same knowledge, they can practice this and become more proficient over time. And that the dynamic assessment allows you to do that with feedback. What are the challenges? I think it's important to think about the challenges, because people always talk about these wonderful things, but how do you have any impact in systemic change? And I don't think that we really have as much voice as we should in trying to think of different ways of changing. So simulations, obviously the challenges, time, money, intellectual property is something people don't think about. When you're working with medical physicians or whatever domain you're working in, you know, they're putting their head into the case development, right? It's their baby. They've been teaching it this way, and they want to have some kind of ownership over this. Well, it's easy to give them credit for that. So you have to find mechanisms where everybody feels like it's a win-win for them, because we're using their subject matter experts to develop these things. The academic challenge, I think, in an institution is the intellectual capital that we all, and time and investment, as I said, that we put into this, is if a physician is working on this with us, you know, how does their development effort into improving teaching lead to some kind of credit for tenure and promotion? Or even for people that are doing design experiments like we do in educational psychology, they take time. And does everybody value the fact that developing these things and testing them takes time? A lot more time than, you know, questionnaire data. So it's an academic challenge that I think we need to think about. Clinical challenge in medicine is access to live and simulated situations so that you can sort of test the two differences. The interdisciplinary challenges are to find teams that can work together to build these learning environments in the way that you want them to be developed. So having the right domain experts, the expert instructor who's different than a domain expert, because as you know, somebody that knows how to do something may not be able to teach something. And researchers interested in this who come from computer science and psychology and education and engineering that can work together on looking at the constructs that psychologists are interested in, such as cognitive, social, emotional, assessment, etc. So the last talk I gave on this was to lots of deans of medicine from Poland who are interested in developing simulations in Poland in their medical school systems. So I pose the leadership challenge to people that actually make these decisions is how do you create opportunities for interdisciplinary partnerships to form for these stakeholders and create opportunities for innovations with the appropriate cohorts and find ways of rewarding people who are already doing too much. And that's my spiel, and any questions are most welcome. That's my leads group, and it's a great group, and here's my little lab and the Atlas lab. So I open up the floor for questions.